telling the history like a movie, like the life itself, with heroes described as human beings with mistakes, passions, and victories. That's the main attractive of this professor, Dr. Pitaluga, head of the research department of the History and Philosophy faculty. From the books to a tangible history, that's the path he builds in every class. We visited him in one of the oldest and most prestigious educational institutions of Cuba, the University of Havana.
Revolución, hegemonía y poder, Cuba 1895-1898.
Revolution, Hegemony and Power, Cuba 1895-1898. It's a book. Actually, it became a book and started as a doctoral paper. A thesis that was sort of controversial, Professor, if we compare it to the traditional ways of interpreting Cuban history in Cuba. This doctoral paper that made you a doctor, your PhD, took as an example the revolution started by the national hero José Martí of 1895, which was supposed to be the final war to gain independence, but ended in the Hispanic-Cuban-American War with a harmful alliance with US that brought awful consequences to Cuba. And I wonder, Professor, that even though today is a book and we can buy it at bookstores and all that, it was controversial, and I want to know why.
We are talking about the year 2009. It was a very controversial thesis because it was against standards and because somehow it deconstructed a discourse and a myth about Cuban independence, and especially about the processes through which the revolution has been constructed, taking the Cuban example in Latin America in the late 19th century. What is it? It is a thesis which explains the maxim that a revolution may be destroyed by revolutionaries themselves. We always are waiting for an exogenous attack, an attack from the outside by the forces which criticize us, and we are not capable to think that the revolution can be destroyed by the very deeds of revolutionaries, especially when you are not aware of what you are doing or also unconsciously. Saying it publicly may be doing as usual, but explaining it from history and showing it turned uncomfortable. And what happened? There were complaints even from the government circles.
Were you accused of being a revisionist?
Yes, I was accused of being a revisionist, of being against the historic process, and of presenting a demonic image of Cuban independence fighters. I think I didn't, just the opposite. It was trying to approach the Cuban independence struggle from another angle to provide a sort of means to understand not just the independence struggle, but Cuban history in general. What should intellectuals do in a revolution? What's the role of culture in a revolution? What about hegemonic processes? There was also the novelty that many Marxist and liberal scholars were combined. I am referring to Antonio Branchi, the original Karl Marx, Michel Foucault, Derrida, or Keimer. There is a combination, a mix of 19th and 20th century intellectuals and thinkers, and with all that, I studied the Cuban independence struggle and ideas and the revolution and explained how all that process was deconstructed. There are myths. The revolution of José Martí was destroyed by his early death as such and by the US intervention. And those two circumstances nearly wrecked a victory which was almost within grasp.
Was that true? Those were the reasons?
I think it is a half-truth. They cannot be denied as historical facts. They did happen. But I think there was a truth which had not been shown until then, namely that we revolutionaries, wittingly or unwittingly, had reproduced the past in the present. And when the past is reproduced in the present, consciously or unconsciously, that present will be misinterpreted, and that's where the big peril lies. And sometimes it is uncomfortable to listen to that.
Some people are afraid of that.
Of course, because you also have the present responsibility and duty as someone living in revolution, to wonder whether it is about you or whether you are being questioned or whether you are questioning the present. And history helps to understand the present.
Were you questioning the present with that thesis?
Somehow I did. But my questioning was a warning. It was constructive questioning with criticism by describing the mistakes which were made. Saying all this based on the mistakes by Martí, Antonio Maceo, Máximo Gómez, and other heroes of Cuban independence was difficult. There was a big fuss, and so to speak, Cuban historiography was kind of shaken up after being dormant for years. The thesis later became a book thanks to Miguel Barnett, who was kind enough to arrange the editing and printing process after there was a whole questioning, because even a committee was created to discuss it. It was a sort of tribunal where, happily, that truth prevailed and it was decided. It was not a political but a scientific issue, something to promote debate and criticism.
Professor, you mentioned, and I can't avoid being a little shocked, when you say the mistakes that José Martí made, that Antonio Maceo made. When we learn history at school, during the first years, then during high school, heroes are perfect. If they made any kind of mistake, was because of the context. I mean, it's like an idyllic perspective of the war, of the people that make the war. It's like extremes, absolutism, good and bad people, black and white, no gray zones. However, you propose a different vision of history, a vision in which people dialogue is a dialectic vision with contradictions, differences, where envy, jealousy exists. Why this idea of history, and why do you teach it like this?
Because it was not a matter of turning history into a series of gossip stories. It is giving it human sense from science and turning it into what it should really be: the study of social processes, understanding the past and how that past has an impact on the present. The Cuban Revolution has been legitimized historically within history as such. History is the first source to legitimize the country and the state. And that has led to writing history in black and white. It is a history of heroes with very little mistakes, which even have not been important. And then that has portrayed men beyond reach. And sometimes, the more you look at them, the more you hear or read about those perfect beings, the more distant they become. Because we make mistakes in our lives, public and personal lives, and that leads to that somewhat detached vision, which will later have consequences in the knowledge of today's youths, for whom history is almost an abstract proposition, almost like a mathematical equation, which is not applicable in a bus or a market. Why is this necessary? Because I believe that for Cuban historiography to make progress, it should change that. And above all, it should also try to put aside the positivistic vision of history we have given to it. You must understand history from philosophy, from demographics, from social sciences. You have to change views. It is the classical example you always give. Marx is used by historians, demographers, economists, and he wasn't specifically a historian or an economist, but yet he was all those things at the same time. Why? Because Marx would not see the world in fragments as social sciences do. More than a historian, a demographer, or a philosopher, Marx was a social thinker. He approached society as a whole. And I believe history can do that, as the rest of sciences also, but it must search for integration. And such integration made my thesis possible. I was able to describe heroes who had families in the revolution, family clans to reproduce power, to distribute power among themselves. They had political clans made up by friends, and it is incredible. There were family and clientele networks of Máximo Gómez, Antonio Maceo, and those networks brought about things like corruption, gambling, and graft. Today, those are things you can see in certain countries in our region. You see them as being distant from us or which affect us very little. But there is the history to know how entire families went to the war to distribute officer commissions and ministries among themselves. There was much grafting in the revolution, which was a modern, true revolution that had José Martí, a man who, no doubt, made mistakes. And those mistakes, in one way or another, had consequences in the war.
Which ones?
I think that José Martí's biggest mistake was his inability to disseminate his ideas. He secretly feared and had the obsession that his ideas would not be implemented well eventually, and he kept them for himself. He was not able to disseminate them. He was not able to make them known. There is an interesting thing. During the 1895 war, many people knew José Martí. They knew about his toils, but they were not familiar with his thinking. And knowing a person doesn't mean you know how he thinks. And not trying to disseminate that information and not trying to convince others was a mistake. There is a good case in point. Martí did try to convince Gómez. Now, their levels of learning were different. Thus, Gómez could not absorb everything. But there were other instances when Martí was not interested to share that knowledge with other independence leaders. And that also kind of turned into a problem in those years.
Me imagino que
I imagine that you might have traumatized a few students with that perspective. Students that came
Yes, of
with all
course.
that biased knowledge about history, good and bad, extremes. Have you had this kind of problems?
esa visión. ¿Le ha pasado eso?
Sure. For instance, actually, I give the classical example of Céspedes' deposition. The great leaders at the time were asked, and all of them agreed he had to go. And Antonio Maceo said, yes, that Carlos Manuel de Céspedes should be deposed. That's not done by a bad person. What you think about an issue in life when you are 20 will logically change when you mature at 40 or 60. It is growing up, the logical change we all have through our lives. The young Antonio Maceo thought a man like Carlos Manuel de Céspedes had to go. And so did Calixto Garcia and Vicente Garcia and others. And students are shocked when they are told that. Students expect to hear about a sacred story in which criticism is forbidden. But it is not a matter of going to the limits of turning history into a class about gossiping and banalities, but of discussing historic processes with men as protagonists. And eventually that gives you a history with bright and dark sides. And that, after all, is a social process. It is studying those bright and dark sides and progress and setbacks.
Le dan, profesor, una varita mágica.
Professor, imagine that someone gives you a magic wand and you get to change how history is taught to the youngest ones. I wonder what kind of thing would you change in the way history is taught?
¿Qué cambiaría?
I would replace reproduction with construction. I would teach them to think. You've got to think. Human beings are by their very nature nonconformists and critical. That's why they progress. Otherwise, they would still be cavemen and wouldn't have invented automobiles or reached outer space. Human beings must criticize, think and rethink all the time, and each generation has a duty to do that. In recent times, the way we've been teaching history has become a reproduction of knowledge, and it is a matter of combining information and construction. There is a very frequent question: what kind of citizens do we want? And the fate of our nation depends on that answer. It seems to me that's the responsibility of history. It is not just the responsibility of history, but it comes into play when circumstances are good for it. But it is necessary that humans think, that they absorb knowledge and ponder it. That was done by the men who led revolutionary processes in this country from the 19th century to the present. Men like Ignacio Agramonte and Carlos Manuel de Céspedes did not reproduce knowledge, and men like Mella did not reproduce it. They questioned it. And you should facilitate such questioning. If you prevent it, there will be rejection and the idea that the history is just political propaganda. That would be a mistake with serious consequences.
¿Qué leer?
What should we read to accomplish that change that you're talking about? And everything that is needed exists to read it?
As a historian who intends to study a historical event or process, I would go to the primary sources. I'd go to them.
Which kind of books?
What was written and thought by the protagonists, the people who lived through those events, and I would reach my judgment, and I tried to read social theories. You have to read theories and methods to analyze, understand something. Later, I'd read about what has been thought, second and third-hand sources, what was said by later historians. I've got to have ample knowledge, and as a historian, I have to be abreast with my realities. For me to be able to understand Baraguá and the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, to understand the revolution in the 1930s, I must watch Cuban TV Prime News and the National Baseball Series and know about the Iraq War and the high prices of produce in any Cuban market and stand. And I have to know about ballet. I have to read about astronomy as much as I can. I must interconnect my thoughts. That's difficult. You can't do it in one day. Somehow it takes education, but I must think in terms of combining thoughts with the constant aim of integrating my knowledge. And the more I focus, the more specialized in a field of knowledge I become, the more I will be unable to grasp the world as a whole.
Usted mencionaba hace pocos minutos.
Earlier, you mentioned Carlos Marx, and it looks like he's only related to economic field because of the book The Capital. Or if you think about the history, probably you relate Carlos Marx to the construction of communism in Russia. But Professor, when you refer to him, you talk like if his ideas were mandatory to understand how a historic process occurs. Looks like is that part of the past, but someone that it should be taken into consideration now to scientific research in social sciences. Are you using a dead reference? Is Marx only part of the past?
Not to me. I've got an essential starting point. Marx did not write a social theory. Marx created a model to understand reality. Turning Marxism, what he said originally.
Why do you specify the Marxism of Marx?
Because Marx's thoughts began being twisted when he was still alive. They were misinterpreted in a way that went away from his original notions. Hence the famous statement by Marx in a letter to a fellow intellectual while referring to the twisting of his ideas that if that's Marxism, then the only thing I know is I am not a Marxist. I mean, unfortunately, in his lifetime, Marx saw the initial twisting of his ideas. That led to two models I can summarize for you very originally, the so-called critical Marxism and the so-called dogmatic Marxism, which permeated the international left in the 20th century. Some scholars were condemned to oblivion, like Antonio Gramsci, by Stalinism, and others were awarded and attained glory, and these were expounding a dogmatic and economy-centered Marxism where culture made no sense.
When you say culture, what exactly do you mean?
Culture not as artistic and literary production, but as a production of life. It was thinking that culture was something outside of society, and eventually that blew up in 1991, in my opinion, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and this whole aftermath between 89 and 91. And we were not exempted from that in Cuba, even more, still today. There is in Cuba a movement of ideas. I would say you can draw a line between the followers of critical Marxism and the followers of dogmatic Marxism. There are accusations or critical approaches in which critical Marxism is seen as revisionist and bad and negative. And dogmatic Marxism is the official Marxism, and that entails both interesting and perilous prices. To me, the original and young Marx, the one I read in Brumiere, the 18th, directly, and other works, is must reading. So much so that today, in the capitalist world, Marx is regarded as an economist. Today, you can go to many European and Latin American universities, and if somebody knows about Marx, you can ask him how he defines him or how he is described in class, and he will say, well, he was a 19th century economist. Why? Because he studied surplus value in such a remarkable way that today, to understand the mechanics of capitalism, you have to read Marx. Capitalists themselves, in their universities, do read him because his analysis of surplus value has stayed unmatched to this day. But the other part, the other side of the coin, that is domination. The exercise of domination has been ignored because Marx found the political tools to explain how culture can be used to dominate the masses. And today you see things like cultural anthropology, the Birmingham School, the Frankfurt School, all these 20th century schools, particularly those in Western Europe, where students are awed by the ideas of Michel Foucault and others, where you can find the Karl Marx seed. It is analyzing the exercise of domination based on cultural processes, but Marx is not mentioned by these authors. Or sometimes they mention him as the past, as a president, but that's all. To me, Marx has present value and is necessary, but the original Marx, the one who expounded critical Marxism, this brings me back to the beginning. When you apply critical notions to Cuban history, it is an outrage for dogmatic notions, and that's why my thesis brought about such a fuss and misunderstanding, quote unquote.
When you talk about the importance of history, Professor, you mentioned how essential it is to read social theory, but those could be seen as a study in practice that new generations do not assume with pleasure. They take it as a task, as a homework, as an obligation. Some of them do it because it's mandatory, others avoid it. Some people, some young people, not only in Cuba but in the world, don't show interest in history. They're focused on the present and the current dynamics. Also, it's important to say that technology and the new scenarios of communication push that view a lot. And I tend to link another idea with this previous one, the fact that there's a process in Latin America very alive, and I would say not only in Latin America, in our entire continent, that defend the idea of oblivion, to neglect the past. Essentially an idea defended by right-wing perspective and conservatism and neoliberalism. That has to do also with laws that promoted not to condemn the crimes of the dictatorships in Latin America that brought a lot of death, and there's a lot of people that are still not receiving the justice that they deserve, families and disappearance, people all over the continent. And I wonder, what are the consequences of seeing these new generations apart from history, from our own history, and the consequences that we've already seen of not taking history into consideration?
Yo creo
I think the
que el
price is
precio
very
es
high,
muy alto.
and several things must be taken into account. Nothing happens by chance, nothing is spontaneous, and nothing is innocent. It is cultural strategies combined with the technological realities of today's world. The time for reading printed things is over. I work with students. The present generations use audiovisuals. I would say to you that 80 or 90% of the information people get about the world and their reality today comes from audiovisuals, and they get or read perhaps 20% of it in books. Is that a risk? Yes, in my opinion it is, but there is no turning back now. It is like the gravity pull. There is no turning back and cannot be stopped because it has been imposed by technological development. And that is also related to a communications strategy of the hegemonic processes in the respective nation states, and also to a global objective that young people think less, that they get more entertainment from and spend more time with the social networks than with books. That is aimed at having people who reproduce and construct less. It is closely related to that aim. We must make history attractive. The challenge goes for the state and the power of the state, and the professors and researchers and historians. It is a collective challenge to face. The most evident example for me, Cuban students, is that I see students who reject the history of their country. They may admit it is a great history. They may admit it is a history of victories and the triumph, but a boring one. We know we made it, that's a fact, we are here, but it is boring. And for a youth today, you have to make it appealing to him by way of critical approach. It is not a matter of telling gossips or a drama show in class about a historical event, but of recreating it so that he understands it in a way he feels it's very close to and personal for him. Generally, today, Cuban professors cannot do it, and that's a challenge I think I am facing also. We have to do it. We have to do it so that the students understand. And it is also a responsibility of the media, which are presenting a black and white history, a history without shades, and only serves to propagandize and inform. And there is a history to propagandize, but there is also a history for construction, and both should be combined, both should be at play. And all these things will make up the whole web of the 21st century. Why ignoring the past? In my judgment, it is a strategy of thought for what you want, a pragmatic approach. I care about my present and I am thinking about my future. But there is a critic, one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century, Lenin, who said that those who do not know their history will not survive it. If you don't know history, you won't survive it. And Latin American realities are proof of that.
Permítame interrumpirlo.
Allow me to interrupt you there. That same analysis in the context of reestablishing relations between Cuba and the United States, who doesn't listen to history won't survive it.
Yo estoy de acuerdo.
I agree. If you ask me which is my deepest fear concerning that negotiating and understanding process between Cuba and the U.S., it is we don't survive history, our history. And our history with the U.S. goes back to the late 18th century. There is a history of relations including all kinds of situations, tensions, threats, periods of passivity, periods for waiting, very intentional and focused policies and processes to Americanize Cuban society. In the early 20th century, there was an Americanization strategy. Cuban teachers went to Harvard for a sort of intellectual recycling. English and U.S. history were must learning in schools. there was a strategy. The thing is that Cuban culture had been very strong since the late 19th century. We lagged behind Latin America as to attaining independence and had the opposite situation. In Latin America, nation states came into being first, and then they strived for citizenship and nationhood. In Cuba, it was the other way around. Nationhood came first, and the nation emerged later. And when we became a nation, the cultural basis was already very strong. That explains why Americanization was not as successful as expected. Cuba assimilated certain things and made them part of its cultural rainbow, but that doesn't mean there are no perils. And now, that idea of a clean slate, of forgetting what took place, is one I will not share. They know it, those there and here. And the price of ignoring history is high because there are behavioral patterns, and you cannot change your behavior overnight. I'm sorry, but it would be hard for me to believe anyone who tells me that they have changed and turned different, because you reach standing in the world thanks to your national history. The Americans are the first ones who shall not renounce to their national history. They are proud of it. They explain and enjoy U.S. expansionism proudly. I cannot forget about my pride and my history. So then it is hard for me to accept the idea of some historians and some trends in historical thinking, particularly outside of Cuba, that the Cuba-U.S. relation in the 21st century until 1959 was characterized by a bond of gratitude rather than dependency. We were a small and immature people who reached adolescence thanks to them. I think there is a Jose Marti, a very revealing figure, and a nation that emerged from a long and eventful cultural, military, and political process in the 19th century, thanks to which we came of age at the beginning of the 20th century. Thus, there is a historical continuity, and I must see myself as I am. But that doesn't mean to go to the other end, that you stick to the past to explain everything and find it hard to think about the future. Life is in the future, you cannot deny that. But I must go for it, having my past with me all the time without feeling nostalgic. The past is not for crying over it. The past is not to be anchored in it and to refuse to go on. You must go on, but with the past, which offers many lessons. A Cuban historian, Manuel Moreno Fraginals, said that history is a weapon, not by chance. It is a cultural weapon, a political weapon, and it is a weapon to explain the dramas of the Cuban nation. This country, like any other country in the world, particularly those in Latin America, have had national dramas. The drama of the Independence War, a late war, the drama of a triumph that was not, the drama between dependence and revolution, between the dependent or independent nation state, the one between the underdevelopment and development, and those dramas of successive revolutions along nearly 80 years, that is, 4 revolutions, are hard to find in Latin American history. As for Cuba, those are processes which define and identify us, as do the domestic dramas the Cuban nation is experiencing today. And all that makes history a constant fellow traveler for a citizen.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
It's been a privilege.